Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's lecture on social contract theory, which is our last moral theory that we will be discussing this semester. So, according to social contract theory, an action is morally right just because they are permitted, that is the action, by rules that free, equal, and rational people would agree to live by on the condition that others obey these rules as well. So that's a mouthful. So let's try to think about each component first. So, what is ultimately morality in this view? Actions that are prescribed by rules that we as a collective would agree on, for which we have reasons, right? Because it has to be rational and we're not being coerced, so we're free and we're equal. And those rules, or the actions that those rules prescribe, is what morality is. And this last component is very important on the condition that others obey these rules as well. Why? The reason is because if others are not obeying the rules, then we are at a disadvantage. And arguably, it would be irrational for us to obey rules that others are breaking. And to see this, consider the prisoner's dilemma. Okay, so maybe just take a minute or a few seconds if you wish to just kind of scan the chart so you have a good idea what's happening. Just maybe some clarifications. So we have two people, Bob and Al, and they are criminals who have been caught essentially. But suppose that the crown or prosecutors don't have enough evidence, let's say, to put them away for a long time. They can only bring certain charges. They cannot bring the most serious charges that they wish they could. The only way for them to do that is to have one of them confess and use that confession as evidence for the more serious crime. So here is the way that Bob and Al have choices. They can either remain silent or they can confess. My apologies. Now, the two values that you see here represent the sentencing that Bob or Al will receive. And the left value, so here's 2, here's 0, these and 6 and 4. So the value on the left side represents the sentencing that Al gets in each of the scenarios. The value on the right side, so 2, 0, 4, 6, represents what the sentence that Bob would receive. Okay? And here are the options, represented by each of these 4 squares. So either Bob and Al can both remain silent, and that is represented by this box. If they both remain silent and they don't confess about the other's crimes, they both get 2 years in jail, let's say. Okay? If Bob confesses, or betrays his friend, let's say, then Bob gets 0 years in jail and Al gets 6 because now he is charged with a more serious crime. Right, and obviously here the bargain is that the prosecution will tell him, oh, if you confess, then we'll let you off, right? Because we don't have evidence that you committed a serious crime, let's say. In the same way, if Al confesses, then he gets 0 years. He gets to walk free. And Bob spends 6 years in jail. Okay? The last option is that both Bob and Al confess on each other's crimes. And in that option, they both end up in jail for 4 years. Now, from the perspective of justice, yes, we want Bob and Al to pay for their crimes, right? But the prisoner's dilemma is supposed to more exemplify a problem of rationality. And here's the dilemma, because if the rational thing is for Bob and Al to want to spend the least amount of time in jail, right? And so the question is, what should Bob or Al do? And what we're thinking about is like, well, the best thing for both surely would be to remain silent because they only spent 2 years in jail and then they're free, right? The worst thing is if they both confess. They both end up spending collectively 80 years in jail. And yet, even though that's the rational thing to do, it seems like when you consider Bob or Al's options individually, it seems like the rational thing for Bob to do, or Al, is actually to confess. And you go, well, why is that? Well, consider the option. Suppose that Al confesses and Bob does not. So let's look at this from Al's perspective. So I'm saying that the rational things for Al to just always confess. Why? Because if he confesses and Al does not confess, then he gets to walk free. And suppose the other option, which is, again, Al confesses, but Bob also confesses. Well, then he gets 4 years in jail as opposed to 6, because if he remains silent, but Bob confesses, then he spends 6 years in jail. This scenario, right? So from Al's perspective, there's only a win-win situation if he confesses, right? But the problem is that sort of rationality or that strategy equally applies to Bob. Bob likewise should confess regardless. But if then what's most rational for both Bob and Al is to confess, and they do in fact confess, they end up collectively spending more time in jail. And that's why it's a sort of a dilemma, I suppose. Because in one way of rationality, they should confess, and in another way, they should not confess, right? Okay, so what is happening here? This is one way to illustrate, and hopefully you were able to do the reading chapter 12, or 13, my apologies, of the social contract theory. And the idea is that this is supposed to exemplify the problem of the state of nature. Maybe you're familiar with this if you've also taken a political philosophy class. According to Hobbes, the state of nature is in which there is just no governments, no rules. Just imagine that there was no government or an enforcer of rules. The state of nature would be a war of all against all, in which the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. People ruthlessly compete with one another for whatever goods are available, right? And the idea is that everybody has self-interest. They want to just have enough for themselves. And so in a state of anarchy, everybody would just fight with each other just to make sure that they're well off, right? And so according to Hobbes and the social contract tradition, the way for us to escape from the state of nature, which is the worst possible state, is for us, we need two things. First, we need beneficial rules that require cooperation, right? That requires multiple individuals to abide by. And we need rules that punish betrayal and an enforcer who ensures that these rules are obeyed. So in the case of the prisoner's dilemma, if they had these two things, they could have gotten the overall lesser sentence, right? If they both went in prior to being caught, let's say, they had agreed, okay, we are going to not confess because that is beneficial for both of us, right? And if one of us confesses, let's say, our boss, let's say they have a boss waiting outside, will kill us. So you need somebody that can enforce the breaking of these beneficial rules. Because if you don't, then again, we go back to the original prisoner's dilemma. So likewise, so again, that's just an analogy. Likewise, in the world, in real life, according to Hobbes, we need an enforcer, most likely the government. And we need a government that will prescribe rules or laws that are beneficial and that we all cooperate to bring about, right? All right. And these rules would be the terms of the social contract. And remember, these are ultimately the rules that determine morality on this view. All right, and they will require us to give up certain freedoms in order to gain certain cooperative advantages, right? So you don't get to just take away my stuff, right? Like that's a way of restricting your freedom, right? You don't get to come into my house and take my stuff or touch my things. But the cooperative advantage is that nobody gets to touch your stuff too, right? So overall, it's a mutually advantage exchange. Even though we are restricting our freedoms, I don't get to hit you, you don't get to hit me, and we're all happy, right? All right. And yes, again, the government will punish us if we steal from one another or we hurt each other, and that is the enforcer for this system. Okay, so now let's talk about a very particular view of this to kind of see like the appeal. And Russ he does talk about Rawls and the original position, but he kind of goes through it very briefly. And I do want to spend more time on this to really get a deeper understanding of the appeal of social contract theory, and in what sense does it rely on our rational agreement as a community of rational thinkers. So according to Rawls, he says, okay, look, so this is like a thought experiment, okay? And it's called the veil of ignorance. And he says, okay, look, consider the original position, okay? And in the original, in the original position, suppose that we're going to structure a society, okay? And we're going to create the rules, the moral rules and otherwise. But in order for us to reason with one another and come up with fair and rational rules, we're going to abstract from all of the contingent features that don't have much to do with rationality. So what that means is that you won't know what you're going to be in this society. You don't know if you're going to be a male or a female. You don't know whether you're going to be born into a wealthy home or born into a home that has a low socioeconomical status. You don't know your health, whether you're going to be born with certain diseases or dispositions. And you also don't even know what your goals or aspirations or motivations will be. Okay, so we abstract from all of these contingent things, all of us. Okay? And now we're behind the veil of ignorance. We don't know what our life is going to look like in the other side of the society which we're trying to create. And so we ask, behind the veil of ignorance, what would we agree on? And according to the social contract tradition, behind the veil of ignorance, we would agree to, and this is from Russ from the textbook, we would come up with prohibitions of killing, rape, battery, theft, and fraud, and rules that require keeping what's word, returning what one owns, and being respectful to others, right? If we're behind the position, behind the veil of ignorance, we would say, okay, well, how about we establish like a basic parameter of rights, like that we're not allowed to kill each other, that we're not allowed to sexually assault each other, or battery, or theft, and fraud. So we would, and maybe free speech, that we are not going to kill each other if we deeply disagree with our political views. Because again, you don't even know what your political views will be in society, right? Great. And that's the way in which you kind of start getting off the ground morality just based on our rational agreement. Like it's rational for us to agree on these things, right? And so we have an explanation as to why is killing bad? Because it would be rational for us to agree in advance that killing is bad. So we actually have an explanation as to why killing is bad, or all of these rules. But we can actually even get more, we can even get a deeper understanding and even try to acquire even principles of justice or fairness, which in a way, we talked about Kant trying to do this, but it was not as specific. So let's talk about now Rawls' particular principles of justice, or how we go about thinking about justice behind the veil of ignorance. Okay, so consider first that there are certain things we all want, and these are primary goods. We actually talked about some already. So we have social primary goods, which are goods are directly distributed by social institutions like income and wealth, opportunities and powers or abilities, and rights and liberties, right? So we already talked about the rights and liberties to a certain extent, right? So if we're structuring a society, you will have the right to your property, the right not to be touched without your consent, and not to be harmed, and so on and so forth, made rights to free speech, and all these liberties, right? But then there's these other goods that we all want too, right? Like certain income, like we want to have the opportunities to have decent job and make a good living, and yeah, these are like the primary goods that we need for each of us to be able to fulfill the conception of a decent life, right? And of course, there's these other goods, what we can call natural primary goods, which are goods that we want, but the government cannot directly distribute, right? Like, for example, like health or intelligence, vigor, imagination, natural talents. Those things are affected by the social institutions we choose to create, but obviously the government cannot directly give us health, right? Okay, so given that we have primary goods, there is this question about how then, behind the veil of ignorance, we should create institutions from the government to distribute these primary goods. And here's like one way to start thinking about this. What distribution scheme would one choose if one is trying to secure access to those goods, right? From the position behind the veil of ignorance. So let me give you a concrete example, because I think that's the best way to think about this. So let me just lay this out. Okay, here are 4 different distribution schemes. So again, let's slow down here just to make sure we're on the same page. So suppose that this is a distribution scheme in which society is kind of divided into 3 groups, right? So divide all of society into 3 groups, and the number here is the primary goods that are assigned to each group. So in this society, in this first distribution scheme, all society gets the exact same distribution of goods, of income. Like the institutions and the jobs are made such that everybody kind of ends up making the same amount of money, right? All three parts of society end up the same. This one has institutions such that it allows a third of the society to make a lot or gain a lot of primary goods. Maybe let's just stick to income for now. A lot of income, right? Oops, my apologies. A lot of income. A third has a lot of income, and the second third still has a fairly significant amount of income, but then 1/3 of society it's pretty poor. The third distribution scheme, again, it has the top third of the society has a fairly significant amount of income. Not quite as much as the second scheme, but fairly good. The second third has 6, so again, fairly good. And then the last third of population has 2, right? And let's just think about a scale of 1 to 10, I guess. It's fine. Yeah, so this one, in this case, I guess they have 1/3 has like almost the maximum amount of money. Now in this one again, a third has 2. It's still pretty low, but it's not as bad as 1, right? And then you have 4, which is the third is pretty well off, not excellent or not amazing, but then the middle brackets also kind of average, a little bit lower, and then the last third also has like the same amount. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. So again, we're just thinking about dividing society into thirds, and how we would distribute the primary goods that we just discussed. So let me ask you guys a question first. So which distribution scheme would the utilitarian prefer? Remember that on utilitarianism, the morally right action is to produce the highest amount of utility, of well-being, right? And maybe this is the best way to think about this, about utility distributions. So which one would the utilitarian choose? That's correct. You probably got this right. The utilitarian would choose 2 because the average utility, so if you add all these together, the average utility is 6.3. This has the highest utility of all the options. And according to utilitarianism, that's the right distribution scheme. Okay. According to Rawls, however, that's not the scheme which, if we're behind the veil of ignorance, again, if we're behind the veil of ignorance, we could rationally think about whether we should structure our society in a utilitarian way, right? But Rawls thinks that if we are behind the veil of ignorance and we don't know what position in society we will occupy, we should not choose a utilitarian distribution scheme. Instead, he thinks we should adopt the following principle of justice or of distribution, which he calls the difference principle. And this is what the principle says. Distribute equally the primary goods unless an unequal distribution of any of these goods, I apologize for the typo, is to the advantage of the least favored. Okay, that's a little bit a mouthful, so let's go through it together. So distribute equally is the idea first, and there's one exception. So always distribute egalitarian or an equal amount. But there's an exception. Unless an unequal distribution of any of these goods is to the advantage of the least favored. Okay, so how does this look in practice? Well, start with this one. This one, according to Rawls, says we should reject 1 because it is irrational if in accordance with the different spirits, so you could have more. So why would we choose this egalitarian schema where everybody has the same if we can just choose number 4? And if you notice, everybody has more, like including even the least well-off technically, which here constitutes 66% of the population, right? Because it's 2/3. They're way better off than here. Why would in the world would we choose to have everybody worse off for the sake of equality? This is what's often called level down equality. It's like, suppose that we want equality and somebody is missing an eye. Okay, so let's just everybody gouge out your eye so that everybody can now be equal. And that's called level down equality. And Rawls thinks that's irrational. Like, we should not be egalitarians just to make everybody worse off so that everybody's the same. Why would we do that? But he says, look, you should actually also consider rejecting 2, even though it allows for a 6th of the population, technically, 66% of the population, or 2/3 of the population, to have a lot of utility. Why? Because it involves the risk of being endlessly sacrificed for the greater good of others. You do not want to risk it be too much. Remember, we are determining which principles or how do we structure society behind the veil of ignorance. Like, you don't know who you're going to be in this world. And if you end up being that 1/3 that is absolutely just sacrifice, essentially, because your utility is so low, maybe because you have low IQ and you're not giving a job by the government, or maybe you have bad health, whatever it may be, maybe you're born in a low socioeconomical status, whatever it is, you do not want to, you only have one life to live. That's it. And you do not want to risk being, as he says, endlessly sacrificed for the greater good of others. So he says for that reason, it's not rational to choose the utilitarian view. Excuse me. Okay, so now we're left with these 2 options. And again, the utility is higher in this option, right? So which one should we choose? You're not that bad off. I mean, you're not great in 3, but it's not as bad as 1. And you have the opportunity to kind of be pretty well off. And overall, the utility is greater. Well, according to Rawls, you should still choose the rational thing, or the difference principle would be to choose number 4. Remember? And he says that you choose number 4 because you should follow this idea of maximin. It's a rational strategy. And here's what the strategy says. Maximize what you would get if you wound up in the minimum or worst off position. So if you have a choice in how to structure society, always think about the worst off position and always make sure that that one has the greatest value of the options available. Because, again, you don't want to risk you being in that position when you actually, let's say, again, this is hypothetical, right? But we can all kind of see the point. And so he says, always maximize to the best of your abilities that worst position off. So in this case, because the worst position is either 2 or 4, he says you should always go for 4. And indeed, this aligns with his difference principle. Remember what the difference principle said? I don't know if I have it in this slide. No, these are just reasons, again, why you should follow maximin, which is don't risk living in a miserly life, right? And this follows the difference principle. If you recall, the difference principle says that you have an equal distribution unless the worst off are made better, right? So that's why in this case you can have a unequal distribution, because actually I guess I should have said this, even comparing it to all the schemes, you should choose 4 and not 2, right? Because remember, he says, according to the difference principle, that you should distribute equally unless, but allowing inequalities, such as in this case, the worst off are made better. And in this case, if you notice, the worst off, let's say, is 2 and 4, the 4 are made much better, right? So he does allow inequalities, but only if the worst off are made better. And that is congruent with this idea of maximin, which is a strategy. Always maximize what you would get if you wound up in the minimum or worst off position. Okay? Here is where, so it sounds pretty appealing. A lot of people have found this very persuasive. But here, let me suggest one particular challenge, which, and again, it depends on your intuitions. And that is the following example. So we have, again, 5.44 and 10.644. Now, what does, maximin says, so the a strategy of maximin just says maximize the worst off position, but in this case they're the same. So maximin doesn't actually decide between these two. And maybe you should pause here and think about, which one would you prefer? Which society? 10.6.4 or 5.4.4? Well, maximin doesn't really distinguish between these two. And 3 seems like there's a lot more utility overall. It seems like maybe 3 is more plausible, right? But what does the difference principle say? Rawls says, the difference principle says distribute equally unless an unequal distribution of any of these goods is to the advantage of the least favored. There is a massive inequality in this one, but the options are not such that it would make the worst off. If the option were that 10.6.4 and let's say 5.4.3, then in that case, the difference principle would support 3, because you're allowing an unequal distribution, but you're making the worst off better. But not in this case. In this case, the worst off technically are the same, and they're not that bad off. And so according to Rawls, you should actually choose, in this case, 4, the least inequality. Because the greater inequality here cannot be justified because it's not doing anything for the least favored. And that's where some people find that counterintuitive. Some people do, it depends. If you have more egalitarian intuitions and you say, oh, that's good, we shouldn't allow so much inequality, then without any reason, like we're not even making the worst off better, then you are going to agree with Rawls and prefer this more egalitarian scheme. But others are going to say, but why does that matter? Why does the inequality in itself matter if the worst off are equally the same? And what if 4 is like a sufficiently good amount? And this is where a lot of philosophers have argued maybe what matters is just that the worst off in a society, or the lower bracket, just have a sufficient amount of primary goods or sufficient amount of utility of opportunities. And as long as they have a sufficient amount, then that's what matters. It doesn't matter how much inequality is obtained in that society. It could be 15 for all we know. But as long as everybody has a sufficient amount of resources and utility, or however you want to think about this, of primary goods, then that's what matters. But notice, my point is that this theory overall, the framework, is so powerful, right? Because we can think about all of these ways to structure society when abstracting and thinking rationally as a cooperative scheme. Like, we're all trying to decide as legislators what kind of rules we would agree to, and we can engage in very interesting and high-level theorizing about principles of justice and morality, right? And so this is I'm trying to display the appeal of the social contract tradition. All right, here are other advantages of the social contract tradition. So morality is a social phenomenon. That is, it requires more than one person. So morality, if you think about morality, even independently from the social contract tradition, it does seem like morality has to do with the obligations that you owe to other people. Like, don't harm people, don't steal. Even think about even the 10 Commandments, which are a historical source of our morality. They all seem to be geared towards either your neighbor or towards God, right? And that's interesting, that morality seems to be geared towards others, not necessarily to yourself. Like, it's not clear that you have duties to yourself. But why not? Why don't you have moral duties or moral obligations to yourself? Well, the social contract tradition explains that. The reason is because you need other people with whom to agree about certain rules, which then prescribe behavior. So it's a social phenomenon, and that's the explanation as to why we only have moral duties towards others and not towards ourselves. So that explains that puzzle. And again, we already went over this, but it's worth explaining. It explains basic moral rules, right? Like, we understand now why murder, theft, etc. are wrong, because behind the veil of ignorance, we would all agree about that we should distribute these protections to individuals, these rights and liberties, right? And not only do we get like the idea that murder is wrong, but we get an explanation as to why murder is wrong, right? We don't have to engage in like intuition, right? Like, we don't have to say, oh, it's just intuitive that murder is wrong. Maybe in certain cases, but not in other cases, right? Or theft is wrong, and we actually have an explanation as to why theft and murder are wrong. Namely, because it would be the kinds of rules that people engaging in this rationalization would justify, right? So we get explanation, an actual justification for moral rules. And it also explains the moral objectivity. right? Because morality, remember from our discussion of ethical subjectivism, seems to be objective. Now, this is the one that might be a little bit, excuse me, difficult, because you might object to this and say, no, Daniel, I don't see how contractualism secures moral objectivity. You're saying that it's based on our agreements, but that sounds subjective. What if a different group of people, the Nazis, agreed that murdering Jews was right? That doesn't seem very objective. That would be a good objection, or at least initially, if the argument of contractualism was merely that what morality requires is what we would agree to. But that's not the view, remember. It's what we would rationally agree to. And there are objective reasons that we use to justify our principles. For example, hurting someone is an objective reason, like causing them pain is an objective reason not to harm them. And we know that that's an objective reason. And so we, as rational thinkers, would use objective reasons to come up with our principles that we would mutually justify to one another. And so, no, you cannot have a society in which killing Jewish people is morally right, because as a matter of fact, there are objective reasons not to harm people because they belong to a particular group, right? We know that that's irrational. Do you see? So that's the way we explain the moral objectivity of morality, by thinking about how we rationally justify practices to one another, and the fact that our justifications are often based on objective reasons. Okay? And lastly, and this is, I think, really important, is that it explains when breaking rules is permissible or civil disobedience, right? If we have agreed to a government and we have consented to have certain rules, but the government has broken that trust, then that's why now we can break the rules, right? Because all of this depends on our social contract, the contract that we have all agreed between all of us and the government, right? Remember that the government is the enforcer here. And if the government or other people break the rules of the contract, then that's when either you know that breaking rules is permissible, and or you can engage in civil disobedience, which is, again, a really powerful idea. Okay, so that concludes our moral theory, and next week we will start on the theory of knowledge. Well, thank you for listening, and I will see you next week.